Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know anybody else who would be interested in coming on the show and chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11. All right, so with that out of the way, I know that our guest isn't at coffee drinking hours, but I got my coffee, but I'm excited for the conversation regardless. So my guest today, Dylan Beattie. Dylan, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey, Isaac, how you doing? And hello, folks out there watching on the internet. Nice to see you all. So yeah, I'm Dylan. It's always people like, what do you do? And I'm like, I kind of do whatever looks interesting, and then figure out how to get paid for it. The official strapline, the best I come up with is that I do interesting things with code, computers, music, video, and technology, and then I travel around and tell stories about it. I've been programming since Amstrad Basic in the late 1986, 87. That was my first computer, was Basic and Logo on an Amstrad 6128. Any folks out there in Europe, you'll have had that as the Schneider 128. And any folks in North America, you've probably never heard of it, because I don't think they ever exported it to the US or Canada. But so yeah, did that. Kind of tinkered. I was one of those, we were just, Isaac and I just chatting before we kicked off about tinkering. And yeah, that was my adolescence, was tinkering with mountain bikes, tinkering with radio controlled cars, tinkering with electric guitars. And eventually I figured out that tinkering with computers might actually be something you can do as a job. And so I did a computer science degree, which taught me half a dozen things that I already had sort of figured out, but I'd figured them out wrong. Like primary keys. Like by the time I learned relational databases as sort of a theoretical computer science concept, I'd built a couple of databases in Access that people were actually using in the company that I'd worked at. And it's like, oh, and it was kind of like, okay, I got it right, but now I know why.
Yeah.
So that was good. To esoteric stuff like Prolog, which I learned for 6 weeks to get through an exam, and then I don't think I've ever written another line of Prolog in my life. And then the whole thing ticking along. This is in the late 90s, 1997 through 2000. So obviously the web is doing it's that phase in the growth of the web. My first job was building websites for companies that had never had a website before.
Sure.
And some of them had we had clients, they did not know. They didn't really understand what they bought, and they had no idea. Like I had people who we'd be like, "Hey, your site is finished." They'd be like, "Can you print it out and fax it to us so we can look at it?"
Cool.
And it's like, "Do you?" And they're like, "We don't have a computer." And I'm like, well, "Why do you want a website?" And they'd be like, "Because we read in the newspaper that we had to have one."
Yeah.
And that was an interesting kind of period. That first wave of adoption, the way in which the world changed from, because I'm right on the cusp. I'm one of the people who, the analog childhood and digital adulthood.
Yep.
So like I got email when I was 17, but that was the same year that everybody got email. So it was, it wasn't a ubiquitous feature of my childhood, but it also wasn't, I worked with a lot of folks who were like, hey, I know you've been doing this job for 30 years and you're a kind of senior vice president, whatever, but you got to do your own emails now.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, what? And, you're dealing with people who they used to send stuff to the typing pool.
Yep.
And suddenly, you're the 18-year-old kid going, no, you type it here and you push this button and it sends it to Australia. And I can't imagine what that culture shock must have been like for some of those folks. But
oh, sure. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that the best way I think you've described yourself in the past, I think, is the guy with the hat or the man with the hat. So that's like the best way that I've always kind of like, oh, Dylan, he's the guy with the hat that you see. But I think that a lot of stuff that you just mentioned, it really kind of scratched a similar itch, right? So like the tinkering thing, like the idea of like, oh, let me just figure stuff out before I know the concepts. You also made a couple of comments about like the web, right? Like, oh, am I supposed to print it out? Like, it seems like while you were describing it, it seemed very much to how people talk about containers today, right? I heard that I need to be on containers, but I don't know what they are. Like, I equate that to 25 years ago. I need to be on the web, but I don't know what that is, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. A good amount of great, I guess, historical context for things.
The thing that's always interesting to me is when the relationship between technology and society kind of evolves. There's this Douglas Adams had this great quote. He said, "Technology stuff that doesn't work yet, because
Yep.
when it works, it's just stuff."
Hmm.
There was probably a day when the wheel was technology because it didn't always
Oh,
work, and
sure.
chairs and furniture and those kinds of things. And the suddenly within our own industry, we have these little kind of microcosms. Kubernetes is a great example of companies that do it. Why are you doing Kubernetes? Oh, because microservices.
Hmm.
Why were you doing microservices? Oh, because DevOps. Well, why were you doing DevOps? Oh, because it's like, come on, there's only four of you. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
write code and ship it. You kind
Hmm.
of you're picking up problems you don't really have, and then you're looking for solutions to the problems created by the last round of solutions you didn't really need. And not to disparage any of these patterns, but conference-driven development is a real thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's when I teach my distributed systems classes and things, I make everybody swear solemnly that they are not going to go back to work on Monday and do any of this because they saw it in a workshop and thought it was cool.
Yeah.
And so and the web was one of those things that it bursts out of the echo chamber of technologists talking, hey, this is cool. Look, we
Hmm.
got the risk architecture, and we've got this new memory strategy, and we've got Apple Silicon. And when something kind of punches out of that, and people who do not do this for a living, people who are not coders, they're not DBAs, they don't run systems, the normal people out there are like, hey, so it's like when you call a plumber out to come and fix your boiler, and they ask
Yeah.
you about blockchain. That's and
Uh,
there aren't plumbers out there asking, so what's the thing with Kubernetes, or
yeah.
what's the thing with microservices? But there was the web, there was blockchain, there's the iPad. It's those kinds of things, the things that really, for better or worse, they burst out into the popular consciousness.
Yeah.
That's interesting to me
I will
because
say
it's
that.
it's
Yeah, I will say this
yeah,
right now. I'm not. I am much grateful that people don't walk, because I used to, like, obviously before the current times, and used to be out a lot more, right, traveling more, customer calls or conference or whatever. And the amount of, like, at the hotel bar conversations that I had with people about crypto, like, I'm very glad that that sort of has, not to, I understand a lot of people lost a lot of money, have lost a lot of money with crypto, but at the same time, it's definitely dampened the level of interest in the, I guess, the non-technical
yeah,
person.
yeah,
But like, I remember having a conversation with a guy, I think he was like a real estate agent, and it was at the hotel bar, and he was trying to talk to me about the intricacies of crypto. And I'm like, look, I'm in technology, and I don't understand it. So if you
yeah,
understand it, good on you. Maybe I'll put a couple $100s in some coin just because it's an interesting investment thing. But by no means do I care at all about the underlying
yeah,
infrastructure. And he was very adamant about it being, Amazon is going to be on crypto, and you can buy cars on crypto. And I'm like, okay. So, and then the next part is, so what do you do? Oh, I sell houses.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Do you want to
I,
sell me a
I, I
house with crypto? For sure, right?
I've likened it before to imagine you're Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 1903, and the Wright
Sure.
brothers have just made their first flight. And,
Yeah.
there's clearly something here. And, you can sort of see somebody might extrapolate from
Hmm.
that. Oh, well, now we can fly, so we'll be able to do all these things in the sky. And we're going to have sky parties where we'll have cocktails. And
Yeah.
that'll be, and you'll fly up there in your own flying plane, and you'll dock with the big plane. And that's when, there'll be receptions and everything.
Yep.
And kind of like there's a certain amount
Hmm.
of optimistic visionary stuff involved in pushing technology because you kind of want the person going, it's going to be amazing, and you need the person going, I'm going to give you 20 reasons why it won't work. And
Oh,
reality
sure.
is somewhere on the spectrum between the two. But to me, the whole crypto NFTs metaverse thing was like someone hanging around Kitty Hawk going, "Hey, do you want to buy Skybucks?" And you're like, "What are Skybucks?" And they're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
they're going to be how you pay for your drinks when we have flying cocktail parties in
Yep.
20
Yep.
years."
Yep.
And it's like, well, 120 years later, yes, it is technically possible to drink a gin and tonic in an aeroplane
Hmm.
that you pay
Yeah.
for using MasterCard, which is backed by a bank.
Yeah.
And,
It
you know,
is like the idea of, not to go down this rabbit hole, but like, I think there is something to say specifically, I think, with technology, that like once the math and the science have been figured out, like you see like this absurd acceleration of innovation, right? Like you
yeah,
see like the Kitty Hawk example, right? Like 1910s, 1920s, and then like 20
Yeah.
years later, like people are flying planes with guns attached to them in a war, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's like the level once people have figured out like, oh, sand can do this one particular thing when you get it really, really hot. Now we
Yeah.
can have dumb devices in our pocket that have every bit of information that ever existed, right? Like it is quite fascinating how fast things do happen
Yeah.
when the science and math is figured out.
I mean, one of the things that I particularly, I did a bunch of research on this for a session I did last year, was domestic internet speed, like how
Mm,
fast the internet connection you get to your houses. And my neighborhood in London, where I live, just this month, I can get fiber to my house.
sure.
They'll drill a hole in the wall, and I got a gigabit Ethernet,
Yeah.
which is just amazing. Like, it wasn't that long ago, like you couldn't get gigabit in your house, let alone to your house.
Yeah.
And now it's like, oh yeah, that's just a thing we do. But I'm still running. I'm talking to you right now on a telephone line, it's 4 copper wires that were installed probably in the early 1980s. And we are doing this call right now over that piece of technology. And the thing that's changed is the capability of the signal processing hardware on either end of it. And, 20 years ago, the best chips that you could get, the best, in signal encoding, signal processing, they could get about half a
Yeah.
megabit out of that cable. Same physical cable now, I got about 35, 40 megs downstream here. It's good enough to do a thing like we're doing right now.
Sure.
And, and I always assumed like to get faster internet, you needed faster cable.
Yeah.
And, part of it is that they have run faster cable to the junction box at the end of my street.
Sure.
So once it gets to the end of the street, at that point, it's running on fiber back to the British, backbone.
Yeah.
But, that's just, I don't know, we have the capability to extract more data from the amount of noise we can cram down that one copper wire. And
Oh,
that
sure.
to me was mind blowing. Like we gone from half a gig or half a meg to 2 meg to 8 meg to 16 to 35 and now they're like, actually, we want to go much faster. Yeah, we're going to drill a hole in the wall. And then you're like, bang. And I'm like, well, if that can do 1,000 with the state of the art now, what's that going to do in 20 years when they figured out all the quirks of how to, optimize the signal processing chain that they use on that?
Yeah, I was thinking. So, like you brought this up, and I was like, oh, like I equate something like Cat 5 or Cat like Ethernet cable, right? Like, how long has that been around for? You mean to tell me that there's not that? Obviously, fiber optic cable is now substantially better, but I imagine you go to 90% of the business parks in the world, they all have Cat 5 running through them, right? And
Yeah.
while you said, I was like, how old is this? Like I just industry standard 2001. So
Yeah.
22 years ago, right? So you mean to tell me in the last 20 some odd years, there hasn't been enough innovation for businesses to adopt in a level that's like, okay, we need to do, like, I remember T1 lines, right? Like there's nothing better
Yeah.
than a T1 line. Spend the millions of dollars and you'll never need anything else again. How long will that last, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy to think. We also get to like this Moore's law problem, right? Where, at the rate of innovation, it eventually stops. But like that initial curve is pretty steep, right?
Now, Moore's law is another interesting one because what it's meant, certainly from what I've seen and read, is that parallelism. Basically, we had faster processors. And Moore's original observation was it was nothing to do with speed. It was about the number of transistors they
Yep.
could put in a certain
Like it was
area
capacity.
of
It was
silicon. Yeah.
capacity. Yeah.
And for a long time that was linear. And just twice as many transistors, chip goes twice as fast. You do that every 18 months. And, he was right in a kind of big way for 35 years.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that if you look at the raw gigahertz clock speed, that's kind of flattening now.
Mhm.
Like, I don't think we're ever going to see a 5 gigahertz consumer processor, not in a single core.
No.
But we can get, dual core, quad core, 8 core, 16 core. It's parallelism. And then obviously, everything's distributed now. If you have enough bandwidth, it becomes much easier to scale the problem. One of the things that I work on a lot is video. And, I render videos and I do stuff with music videos, those kinds of things. And that's a real interesting problem because you can, if you do it locally, then obviously there's no network to think about. It's just how big is your
Yep.
hard drive and how big is your RAM. But then you got to render the whole thing yourself,
Yeah.
and it takes time. And even the sort of the upper limit, it feels like my entire career. There's been it's going to take 16 hours. No, I can't be bothered. But if
Yep.
it's like, yeah, it'll get done in like 4 hours. That's the point where you're like, all right, let me just push go, and then I'll go and do something
Yeah.
else while it grinds away. And that kind of still applies. I still do rendering jobs which take 3 or 4 hours to run. Now you could do that in the cloud. And he's like, yeah, well, then it'll be done in 15 minutes if you have a big
Sure.
enough credit card. But
Yeah.
then it's like, well, great. Now, the 15 minutes, what you've got in the cloud is 4.5 gigabytes of high quality, high definition MP4 video that you can't watch until you download it.
Yeah.
And so you're like, well, great. It's in the cloud. I actually need it over here now.
Not only do you
So,
need
and
to download it, but you need to download the whole file. Because in a lot of
yeah,
cases with really, really high lossless video and audio, like, the internet is only so fast, right? If you want to maintain
yeah,
the quality, right? Like I
yeah.
use Plex, and occasionally now and then I have Plex set up where I can view it outside my house. And
Plex is the thing where you have all your media at home, but then you can watch it on your
correct.
mobile when you're out on the road and stuff.
Yeah, or you can,
Yeah.
if you pay the right amount of money, you can go to apps on TV. Most televisions have a Plex app, and like obviously on
Okay.
your phone. Yeah, it's like media management that you can access external to your home network. And like occasionally I'll be like, okay, so I'll go into a hotel and I'll like give me like the lowest quality because I know hotels speeds are what they are. And even that chunks. So I'm like, okay, it's not like it's trying to send like a 10 gigabyte file to me. And it's saying, I can't do this, make it smaller, make it smaller, make it smaller. And then eventually the smallest version is still too big, right?
Yeah.
It's so I've just made the habit of before I go on a trip, I just download every single video or movie that I want to watch, and I just I have a laptop that's a terabyte hard drive because
Yeah.
disk space is so damn cheap. So it's funny that the pendulum is swaying, right? Because storage used to be very, very expensive, and to an extent, computing, because there was limits to how much you can put in it, was fairly inexpensive. Now we're going down this other path where disk is cheap, and if you want to buy a graphics card, it's going to take, well, I mean, maybe not as much now with crypto mining being kind of dead, but like you try to, $2,000 for a graphics card.
It's nice to be able to say that.
Yeah.
It's like now people, graphics card, the price is now being set by people who actually want to do graphics again.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a much better place than where we were, a year ago. So,
Yeah, I hit kind of like the lottery. So I got a GTX 3090 like a month after they came out at retail. And for a split second, I contemplated just literally just putting the box on eBay and just making 10 grand. But I was like, no, because I bought it because I don't want to take 45 hours to encode a video. Now it takes me like 20 minutes, which is great. But there was this like little inkling. It's like, but you can make so much money off of this thing.
yeah, but then what would you spend it on? Because you'd be like, yeah, what I really want is a graphics card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's definitely a first world problem, right? Like, I mean, if I could just, I really need this, but I could sell it for more money, but I really don't need the money, right?
Yeah.
Which is definitely interesting. One of the things I'd love to talk to you about is, and we talked about this a little bit before we got started, so I apologize for you having to kind of reiterate your thoughts, but
Yeah, that's fine.
in your line of work, so like you work for yourself, right?
I do.
And there's this healthy balance of having to make money and having to promote yourself. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts as somebody who, maybe you might not say so, but at least as for me, my perspective, has figured it out how to like balance that very well. Like, what are some of the things, obviously, when you first started going down this road, that you realize like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to allocate some of my time just eating money, and so I can focus more on growing brand versus those things. Like, you know what I'm trying to say. So like, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
So first of all, I wouldn't say I figured it out.
Well, it's certainly maybe to you, but I think to the world, a lot of people see you as somebody's like, oh, Dylan has kind of figured it out. Like, they speak a lot at events. They obviously, they don't like I see a nice guitar in the back. Like, you have very nice internet. So like, you figured it out to an extent, right?
Yeah, I've certainly I did manage to not take any hit in income when I switched from having a, I was a salaried CTO of a tech training hub company here in London, and when that job disappeared, I that was kind of the push I needed to go, and I was like, I'll give it a year, I'll try doing my own thing, and then the pandemic hit very shortly after that. So it's kind of, 3 months to figure out what I was going to do and get things set up, register the company and bank account. And then 6 weeks of kind of hustling and going, hey, yeah, I can, who wants to book some training? I can do this, I can do that. And then the pandemic hit, which kind of changed all the rules about where do you go? Who can you talk to? How does it work? What can you get paid for? And we are kind of still, I think, figuring some of that stuff out.
Hmm.
Uh, the difficult things about it are when you get up in the morning and you don't actually have anything booked that day. How do you
Yeah,
decide what to work on? And
sure.
that's the thing. I was watching Chris Klug's talk in Sweat Talk last week, where he was talking about hyperfocus, and he was talking about ADHD, and I'm in the absence of any diagnosis, I'm pretty sure I'm not, but there were certainly elements of what he said,
Hmm.
like this
Yep.
ability to get immersed in a piece of work and then you look up and it's been 6 hours and you've forgotten to eat anything and
Yep.
you've forgotten just like, oh wow, I thought that was like half an hour. I should get lunch now. It's 4 p.m. And I most of the best, what I think is the best work I've ever done has been produced in that sort of state of
Yeah.
hyperfocus. But the problem is hyperfocus, you can't control it. You can't decide
Sure.
what you're going to focus on. And so you have the stuff you want to do, you have the stuff that you're good at, you have the stuff you can get paid for, and you have the stuff the world needs.
Yeah.
And it's trying to find the balance. And I've been lucky enough that the teaching people distributed systems design with .NET kind of that pays a lot of the bills
Sure.
because there are, we, I think we as an industry, certainly folks have been around a while, we forget that other people who are just starting out in their career or a little bit, further along or further back on that journey than we are, they haven't seen this stuff before.
Sure. Yeah.
And, there's I think a thing a lot of folks do when they're like, well, I don't have anything really advanced. Like I'm not doing C plus, or I'm not doing C sharp 11, or I'm not
Yeah.
doing .NET 7, or I'm not doing Kubernetes. It's like, that's all right. There are tens of thousands of professional developers out there whose boss has just said to them, hey, we need you to build a subscriber for a message queue. And they've never
Hmm.
seen that before. They don't know
Yeah.
what that is.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, we need to build an API. And they go online, they go on Stack Overflow, and it's like, yeah, APIs are built using SOAP and REST and Disco and WSDL and GraphQL and this thing and
Yeah.
gRPC. And by the way, we have JSON transcodings for gRPC. And what I try to do in that is I'm like, look, you give me 2 days of your time, and pay for a ticket, obviously, and I will try to give you the most rounded kind of hands-on introduction. This is what these things look like. This is how they work. This is when you'd use them, and what to look out for, and how to kind of go on from here. And it's not a substitute for the experience you get running them in production, but it gets good feedback and it gets good numbers. So that's part of it,
Yeah.
is find something people's bosses will pay for.
Sure.
And ideally something that, reusability is another kind of big factor here. Because we were talking a little bit about this before we went live on the stream today. But the worst feeling in the world is when you build something that you don't really want to do, but you think everyone else is going to
Yeah.
go for it, and then
Yeah.
they don't, and then it goes out of date. You and you're like, well, actually, everybody loses there because there's
Yeah.
no audience appeal, there's no reuse, and I didn't enjoy it.
Yeah.
And so, the balance there is about, pick stuff that's actually kind of, it's not always going to be fun because
Yeah.
the anything, no matter how much you love it, when you do it for a living, it stops being as much fun as it used to be.
Oh, I
Um,
I totally agree. And again, like a lot of great stuff to plug out from there. So full disclosure, Dylan and I were just at an event together in Sweden at the beginning of February 2023 for folks that are listening to this in the future.
hey, the
And we,
future.
yeah, and
How's it going?
we both were at the same talk where a friend of ours, Chris Krug, did a talk kind of on a lot of different, mental health sort of things. And I think one of the things that I took away from like the hyper focusing thing is somebody who hyper focuses a lot. I mean, it's not hyper focus though. It's like marketing brands that's flow. We want to get into our flow, right? Which is,
Yeah.
oh, I mean, I'm very guilty of forgetting to go to the bathroom. Like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom, and then like, oh, I guess I don't have to go anymore. And my wife will ask me, how much water did you drink today? I'm like, none.
What is that
No
a thing I'm
water.
supposed to
No
do
water.
today? Yeah.
No water. And then I realized, oh, I didn't go to the bathroom a lot today because I didn't drink enough water. Anyway, beside the point. But I think, one of the things that you said that was very, very interesting, specifically about content. And as somebody who is in this content delivery space, speaking at events, creating content, like you'd be very shocked to find out like the sort of content that actually brings you joy versus is, I guess, low-hanging fruit that you're going to capture. Like my favorite talk that I like to deliver, and I've been delivering it for a long time, is simply try like, what do I do with my old .NET Framework apps? And I literally just talk about the history of .NET a little bit, and then some of practices that I've seen be successful in taking your old apps and migrating them to like a modern version of .NET. And I'm always surprised because I believe that people are paying attention. And then you sit in a room with 30, 40 people, and you realize that most of the people there are not have not paid attention, which is fine because some people don't want to know what the latest is going on in .NET and don't read articles in their spare time. But like, the simple question, did you know .NET runs on Linux? So half the people raise their hand. Like, okay, that's interesting. And then, who here has a Samsung TV? Oh, well, your TV can run .NET applications, right?
Yeah.
So I think...
I mean, I had
go ahead.
The experience. So just before SwitTalk last week, I was at another event in Stockholm, which is JFocus, which is a big Java conference.
Yep.
And Java is a huge, vibrant community of developers and platforms and frameworks. And a lot of people who were kind of they made a choice in their career that took them away from .NET 10 or 15 years ago. They have no idea what's happened.
Yeah.
Because when they left, it was a closed source proprietary framework that ran on Microsoft Windows, and you had to pay Microsoft for the operating system, and you had to pay Microsoft for the Visual Studio unless you were really, really kind of masochistic and you wanted to use the C# compiler from the command line and write your MS build files by hand. And, for people who were already on Windows and doing, WinForms development, that kind of stuff, it was great. A lot of other people like, this doesn't solve my problem.
Sure.
And they turned away. And once they turned away, you got to, if you want to reach those people, you got to go where they are, because they're not going to come to your event.
Nope.
Because why would they do that? And two, you have to be prepared for the fact that they're like, look, I don't care how good it is now. This is my thing. And individual developers are, they are, unless it's a job change. Something I do see is people who are like, I'm looking for a job, and there's this job, but it's .NET, and is it still just the Windows thing?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh no, it's really not. It's changed a lot, and that's something it's nice to be able to do, is to reassure people, look, take another look, and then make a call. And they come back and they're like, yeah, actually, I can use my Mac laptop to build this stuff. We can deploy on Linux, which I know how to administer. And we got a question in the Twitch. Fig Guy says I can write a .NET app for my TV. Yeah, you can. It's
you
Tizen.
sure can.
Samsung Tizen is one of the .NET runtime platforms, and it runs on Samsung smartwatches as well. So that's fun. And one day maybe Samsung are going to release a Galaxy phone that runs .NET natively. Maybe, I don't know. Do you think we're ever going to see that?
I don't know. I mean, I think at the end of the day, like if it's advantageous to the vendor to like, I think, and this is to maybe go down a better rabbit hole, right? There's a reason why the Windows Phone was never successful, right? And I think it's very, very clear developers didn't want to have to build another kind of app. I think we're getting to this point now where there are a couple of different ways to build an app one way, right? Like you can use React Native, you can use Flutter, you can use .NET MAUI. Maybe there's something to say, like maybe it makes sense to be able to natively compile a .NET MAUI application on a Samsung phone and it runs, right? Like, again, why not?
I was always really, really sad that, and the main reason Windows Phone didn't work is just that it was third.
Yeah.
That was it. We already had Coke and Pepsi. There was no market for a third brand of cola. And, I remember, because I held off, because I loved Nokia. Nokia, just the days of feature phones, Nokia was so good. So I didn't get a smartphone until Nokia released the N97. And when they did, I bought an iPhone because it's like you've had 18 months to get this right and you haven't. And then, didn't Microsoft acquire Nokia's handset division at one point?
Yep.
And it's like, come on, if you can come out here with a Windows native smartphone running on Nokia engineering, maybe you can just pull it off. And they didn't. It was too little, too late, and it's the quarter of the market who care about the newest shiny thing. We're all
Yep.
running iPhones, and everyone else was like Android, open source, Java, Linux kernel is fine, and that ship has sailed. So
Yeah. It
um,
doesn't work. It doesn't work in a lot of cases, but like the old adage is like if you're first, you're too early. If you're third, you're too late, right?
yeah,
Like that second place, like where you don't eat a lot of the research costs, you don't eat a lot of the early adopter costs,
yeah,
but you have an opportunity to build market share when you have one competitor, right? I think
yeah,
the Windows Phone, in my opinion, better camera, more aesthetically pleasing. The UI was way better at the time than iPhone, or just no apps. Like
yeah,
no apps. And
yeah,
at that point in time, like mobile web wasn't like really good. Like you didn't have Twitter Bootstrap, or you didn't have, maybe you had Twitter Bootstrap, but you didn't have like this really, really great, these amazing abilities to just render screens for smaller devices. So people were forced with like text only browsers, basically.
yeah.
And here we are. VCR versus beta, our friend says. Like, I
Hey,
mean,
Laserdisc for life.
laser disc for life. Exactly. Well, I was watching, my wife and I were watching a show. I can't remember what show it was now, but like there was a point in time when everybody had like a Sony Walkman, like the CD players, right? But
Yeah,
no cars had them. So there was
yeah,
a device that you could buy that plugged your CD player and had like, it was a little tape, and the tape would go
yeah,
into the thing. And we're watching the show, and this person pulls it out. I'm like, I didn't even remember that existed. And I
yeah,
used it every day. And it's, the
yeah,
technology has passed us. Like, it's crazy to think there are shims that are put into place to kind of help us progress from one, I guess, era of technology to another, and how quickly we forget about them.
yeah,
And now, like the Microsoft phone that gets built that runs Android, coincidentally enough. So there you are.
yeah,
One thing that's also quite interesting. We were talking about this before again because we talked for ad nauseum about all sorts of things Isaac was interested in. Like your style of storytelling, it goes very interesting, like with historical, or today I learned, or did you know, sort of content, right? Like,
yeah.
is that to go back to what we were talking about with you being a tinkerer and liking to understand how things work? Is that what feeds into it and brings you joy, or is it because you
Yeah.
back to the reusability thing? Like, is it a combination of both to some extent?
I mean, I think that, when it comes to one's relationship with technology, which, as a developer, that's important.
Yep.
One is how does it work? And then the second is why does it work that way?
Yep.
Because so much of what we do is somebody made a decision once upon a time. They decided they were going to use angle brackets instead of curly brackets, and
Yep.
bang, HTML is like that now.
Yep.
And it didn't have to be. It just was. That's, someone made a call. And when they make the call, they make it on a day where it's like, we got to pick one of these or the other. Let's just go with that one. And you add up all those kinds of decisions, but then you bring in the sort of cultural context and the background and the ways these different technologies have evolved. What I'm always fascinated by is discovering something that people would never have heard of, something that is obsolete. And I'm researching a new talk at the moment, which I'm going to be giving at Beauty and Code in Sweden at the start of next month, about typography. And it starts off as my interest in this started as, hey, TrueType fonts, that's cool, we can make the text look different. And everyone's done that. You're writing a paper for school or whatever, and you're like, oh, I got to pick the right font. And you think is and it's like a lot of these things, fonts are not something most people think of as being an interesting technology.
Yeah.
It's you just pick one, and you're like, well, actually, you ever think about how a font works? You think
Hmm.
about, and I've been building websites long enough, that I remember when the web, you had Arial or, Times or
Yep.
Comic Sans, and if it wasn't, you couldn't put a font on your website.
Yeah.
You used the font, you had a best guess, like, well, what might our users already have? They might
Yeah.
have Arial, they might have Helvetica, or they might have something that's like a sans serif typeface. And lots of websites out there still are like, hey, font family,
Yeah.
Arial, Helvetica, sans
Yep.
serif.
Yep.
That's what you got. And you start digging into it, you discover, web open font formats, and then you've got, did you know that there's like a font is copyrighted? So it's actually owned. Like some fonts, you want to use a specific font, you got to pay for it, but then you put it on your website where anyone can download it and render text in it for free. And
Yeah.
how do you even get started with, that kind of thing? Because you don't want DRM to be able to draw text on a website. And one of the things that I found is that you dig into a font file, and modern, like a TrueType or a WAF or an open font file is basically, all right, we had to put all this stuff in so it worked on Windows, and then we had to put all this other stuff in because that's the stuff that the Apple Mac wanted, and then we got all this other stuff that's in there because PostScript needs that stuff. And the information which controls a font layout on a web page in 2023 was put there for OS2 Warp, which most people in 2023 do not even remember that ever existed
Sure.
if they'd seen it in the first place. And but you're like, no, it's there. Like you go and you look through the metrics, you find this bit. If the font looks wrong on your web page, that's the bit you got to change. And they're like, what is OS2 Warp? And it's like OS2 Warp was gonna defeat Windows. It was, Microsoft Windows was dead, and OS2 Warp was the future, and IBM and Microsoft collaborated on it. And of course, what happened is Microsoft went, well, actually, we kind of been working on Windows in the back as well, because we got
Yeah.
Windows NT4 is also sort of ready, and what was it, the IA64 architecture didn't actually turn out to be as good as everyone thought it might be, and we've got you know, and that's, quirk of history. You imagine, someone digging through font files for the first time going, what even is this stuff?
I mean,
But then,
just the fact,
that,
the
yeah,
idea of digging through font files, right?
yeah,
Like, I mean, if it doesn't work, like, oh, okay, new font, right?
yeah.
Like, to tap into Dylan's tinkerer mindset, right? Like, why does this A look weird? Oh, let me just open up the file and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
muck around and see what's going on. Like a lot of people would just bag it, right? Like,
Yeah. No, it's I love the idea that I remember when I first started programming, as a kid doing hobby programming and stuff, and there were the programs I could write, which were written in BASIC and they were just text, and then there were the proper programs which had graphics and stuff. And then I was like, hey, can I make graphics? And it's like, yes, you can. You learn how to make graphics. And, Visual Basic, I remember the first time, VB4, VB5, whatever version it was, it's like, I can make applications that look like the real ones and
mhm.
work like the real ones. And that's where it's like, well, that's because the real ones are also made using Visual Basic. Like, this isn't fake.
Yeah,
This is real. That's how the developers are building the apps that you are using to do stuff.
yeah,
And I love that idea of kind of breaking down that perceived boundary between the stuff you can build at home and the stuff which is real stuff.
yeah.
In all kinds of domains, technology is obviously the interesting one. But like, I love reading recipes for how to make food exactly the way they get it in restaurants. Like the
Sure.
people out there who
Yeah.
reverse engineered how Pizza Hut make their pizza bases, or trying to replicate the KFC 11 herbs and
Yeah.
spices, or there's an open source recipe that claims to be Coca-Cola,
I was just about to
and
mention Coke. Like, so
yeah,
in Atlanta in the States, that the Coca-Cola Museum, supposedly they have like the original recipe behind a safe, and it's all the silliness. It's probably not there. It's probably somewhere even more secretive. But I was talking to somebody. It's like, do you really believe that nobody has figured it out? Like in this world where you can use a mass spectrometer to figure out, like,
yeah.
reverse engineer like any medicine, like that, literally, like, oh, like it's this amount of sugar, it's this amount of cacao, like whatever, right? Like, you mean to tell me that Coke, like, you can't redo Coke?
So,
I don't
so
know.
one of the folks in the stream chat has just asked, do we know who KFC follows on Twitter? And I
Yes,
do, and it's
yes,
brilliant. You know this one?
yeah. It's
So
11. It's 11 herbs and a spice.
it's 6 herbs and 5
That's
spices.
that's right. The Spice
11,
Girls.
11 herbs and spices. So
Yeah,
it's the
and
5 Spice Girls.
yeah, Yeah.
and six guys called Herb, which it's brilliant. That's
Yeah.
so good.
I believe
And didn't they did that for like 3 years before anybody noticed? And the
yeah.
person who noticed, they sent them like a painting, a framed painting of Colonel Sanders or something, because someone had finally figured this out, which is that's the thing I fear we may have lost with Twitter is that kind of corporate whimsy. Like, big, massive, multi-million dollar companies been like, yeah, it's just Twitter. It doesn't matter. Let's
Well,
do it
now
for the
now
lols.
it's super forced, right? Like you
Yeah.
see, occasionally you'll see random corporate accounts like navigating through like some thread, and it's like, oh, they're just there for visibility, right? Like I can't remember there was a really good example a couple of weeks ago, and I literally saw it, and I was like, that makes me very sad that like this company, maybe it was like an airline or something like that, was
Yeah.
like they had to like drop themselves into it because they thought they had a silly play on words. And that's the problem with big companies having social media teams. You hire people that their job is to figure out how to turn your boring brand into something that's not
Yeah.
boring, but never forgetting that your company is still boring because it's been boring for 70 years, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with your company being boring, but don't try to be hip unless you're trying
Yeah.
to do something that's actually interesting. Yeah, it's like they're like a lot of airlines, like they went down this path of doing like oh, we love our customers, we love our like, I don't want to call any up by name, but it's like, airline Y loves you. And then I jokingly with my wife was like, okay, so they're gonna not kick me off a plane if it's full, like
Yeah.
they're gonna find a seat for me on this plane when it's full. Nope. Nope.
And I think, that the reason why I think some brands can get away with it is that, I mean, airlines are always in the precarious position of, nobody wants to go on an airplane.
Yeah.
Like, nobody, you choose an airline because you need to be in the city over there and they
Sure.
fly there.
Yeah.
You're not doing it for fun. And they can dress it up as much as they like with, but the second that they invent, you snap your fingers and you teleport. That's it.
Yeah.
Air travel as we know it is over,
Yep.
apart from helicopter rides over the Grand Canyon and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone in the chat talking about Ryanair's Twitter account.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've flown Ryanair. They also don't DJF about people on their planes either. So
Ryanair, I always was amazed that Ryanair didn't just have a vending machine where you could buy an apology.
Yeah.
Like you land and they're like, do you feel you've been treated badly? Get a handwritten apology for only £15 and you put your MasterCard in and out it comes.
I think
but that like the difference between like KFC, people buy KFC because they want a bucket of chicken.
Yep.
It's, apart from maybe a handful of scenarios, it's not like, oh, well, I need calories to live and this is literally my only option.
Yeah.
It's a luxury, it's a commodity. And so they don't have that thing of, angry people who are being forced to eat a bucket of chicken that they didn't really want, but it's the only food they have to live. Whereas airlines, it's like, no, I have to get to
Some
Boston
people,
today. And
I think there's something too, and I mean, not to pick on airlines, but and to kind of circle back to like talking about technology, like, it's a customer service business, but it's also a technology business. Yes, I understand that the you make the money by putting the people on the piece of metal and throwing it through the air as fast as possible. I understand that. But at the end of the day, customer service to technology is how you actually make the money. And so like when you see airlines not spending money in technology or thinking they can kick the can down the road with technology, it's like, okay, so, maybe we should, and not to knock anybody who's ever built mainframe applications, but there are better ways to write apps today than mainframe applications. So maybe we should look into using that technology, maybe have some interesting innovations that come from that.
see, that's one of those classic examples where I'm like, the legacy here is the challenge. There are better ways to write applications than mainframes. Problem is the mainframe's already there.
Yeah.
And, unless you are, because you can't really bootstrap a competitor to the aviation industry, because you need runways and you need the FAA and you need radar and you need certification and you need Boeing and you need Airbus and, the whole thing. And, is it Amadeus, the international thing that manages all the flight itineraries that can't cope with anybody with accent characters in their names?
I was at the airport when a particular airline adopted Amadeus, and it was quite an experience. Like I remember there being people who's they had on their jacket had Amadeus trainer walking around
Yeah.
the airport.
Yeah.
And I remember talking, like briefly talking to somebody who was obviously very, very stressed out. And I said, "How's it going?" They're like, "It's okay." I'm like, "Are you learning something new today?" "Yes." "Are you enjoying learning something new?" "No." Like, so, and I imagine that these folks weren't given proper
Yeah.
ahead of time training. So like, oh,
Yeah.
you're gonna train at the airport with 10,000 people yelling at you. So
Yeah.
have fun, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I think one thing that's also very, very interesting, and to kind of talk about, to continue this conversation about like maintaining legacy versus adopting something new, is like there are all these different factors, and a lot of companies don't want to stomach the cost, especially like to use the mainframe example, right? Like mainframes are still around because mainframe apps, like they don't break. Like they've been around for 60 years because they don't break. And
Yeah, but could you argue they don't break because everyone's terrified of touching them?
well, yes, yeah,
Like if you could go into your mainframe code,
yeah.
right click, refactor, rename variable, boom, deploy, done. It'd be like, oh no,
Yeah.
it does. You can break it actually. It breaks really easily.
Yeah, I feel like it's I think it was SAP that I remember having a conversation with somebody. It's like, yeah, the core code base has not been touched for 35
Yeah,
years. Like, because if you were to break that, like, no, not good.
yeah,
Because there's like four people probably at the entire company that can still
yeah,
operate figuring that out. But I guess my point being about adoption of new technology, right? Like
yeah.
you talk to people, right? When people are apprehensive about adopting new technology, especially like your microservices course, right? Like, what are some anecdotes that you have used in the past that land pretty well? Like, is it, saving yourself in the future by investing currently, or like, what are some of the things that you've used that help? Or is it just like, oh, mileage may vary based on a conversation?
Something that, I mean, to address the broader topic of, legacy and the cost of maintaining legacy code bases and stuff. There's a quote that I've used a lot, which is legacy code is code that's too profitable to delete and too scary to change.
Yeah.
Because, the reason why it still runs is we need it. It's doing a job. People are paying to use it. And, one of the things that I think a lot of companies and organizations could do a lot better is we'll figure out how much of our revenue, can you apportion revenue and even down to the level of individual customers? Can you figure out, well, who's actually using this thing?
Yep.
And where do they live? And how much would it cost just to go around there and, buy them a really nice dinner, send them to Hawaii for the weekend, and
Sure.
just be like, we got to switch off the thing. You're the last person left using it. I remember running a big website that was working in the show business, professional services for film and television and stuff, when the BBC were migrating off Internet Explorer 6. And that was literally why do we need to support IE6? BBC. Why? And eventually it's like, we got hold of the BBC and said, look, when are you upgrading? And they're like, 3 months. We're like, okay, there we go. We have the window on it. And we're like, yeah, we're gonna stop supporting IE6 3 months from now. Like everything new we build
Okay.
after that, it ain't gonna work. We ain't gonna test it on IE6 anymore. And that was an example of a big customer that was really important. But then we had a handful of other people, and some of them were like, well, they're just around the corner. Like, someone go around there with a box of chocolates and
Just ask.
Firefox on a
Yeah.
USB
Yeah.
stick and just say, hi, we'd like to upgrade your computer. And it worked.
I don't think
you know,
Firefox on a USB stick probably works anymore. But I mean, it probably 15 years
this
ago it
was
might
this
have.
was
Yeah.
when IE6 was
Yeah.
still a good idea. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it always is shocking to me too. And I think to go back to, the point you're making of like, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Like, I'll walk through a train station or whatever. And it's always like
yeah,
these like not old, it's not fair, but like, this not technology isn't core to their business, but it's very in your face for customers.
yeah,
Like train station, and then you'll see like a Windows XP like start menu,
yeah,
and you're like, okay, well, obviously they need to probably have a
yeah,
conversation with somebody. And I think one thing that it's always happens to be, sadly enough, in a lot of the public space, right? Government, municipalities, things that are tied to that sort of thing, because the cost
Yeah.
to do some of these things is really, really challenging. But then you talk about like, oh, we need to be on Kubernetes. Like if anybody's actually like done Kubernetes at scale, it's not like like, I mean, it is cost effective, I guess, at the scales of scale, but
Yeah.
it's, I guess it's on sharpening the curve, I guess you could say, right? Because it stays somewhat expensive kind of forever, right?
Yeah.
Like you stand up a new Kubernetes cluster and it's like, oh, like there's $150 to do nothing, right?
Yeah.
Like, so how do we fix that? Like, how do we figure out, how do we have a conversation with customers, conversation with people, developers in general about, like, you need to be able to figure out effective ways to convince your boss that it's worth it, right? Because
Yeah.
I think that's what the real problem is, like convincing your boss that it's worth it.
I mean, that's a hard one because, the two things which are conspicuously absent from most of these conversations are engineered lifespan and risk.
Yeah.
And, in most, certainly, civic infrastructure things, it's like this bridge is good for so many years.
Yep.
And you know that when you pay for it, and you know how long it's going to take to build. And once it's in, you know what you need to do every year, you know how often it needs to be inspected. And, we've learned sometimes through accidents and, serious consequences, we've learned what happens if the inspections don't happen and if the things are wrong. And in software, we're kind of like, well, it's finished. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, it's not finished. It's just beginning. Like the day the system goes live, that's day one. That's not the end of
Yeah.
the project. That is the beginning of the product's lifespan as a going concern. And, I don't think I've ever seen anyone launch a new software application and go, this is going to be good for 5 years. And after 5 years, this is what's going to happen. These are the things that you need to look out for. And what I think drives that more than anything else is nothing to do with risk and quality. It's to do with recruitment.
Sure.
It's to do with you have a system built in. I don't know. Let's say classic ASP. That was one that I did a lot of work on back
Sure.
in the day.
Yeah.
So 20 years ago, 25 years ago, classic ASP. Yeah, it was that or PHP or CGI scripts and Perl. And, those classic ASP applications, SQL database, active server pages, it worked. You shipped it, that's it, done, finished. And, those kind of applications now, there are probably still some running. I think a couple
sure.
of things I built are still out there in production.
Yeah.
You go to the market now, you go and say, hey, we're hiring for classic ASP developers. And you'll find a handful of people who are like, yeah, that's literally all I do. That's my specialty, and I'm going to do that till I retire. There aren't many of those people, and they can basically name their price. But you don't find, anybody. Nobody is graduating university or coming out of boot camps now looking for a job maintaining classic ASP.
This is true.
And so you want. I hate to use this phrase, but if you want cheap developers, then you got JavaScript.
Yeah.
Because JavaScript is what they are teaching, the 12-week boot camp for folks who are just getting started or they're changing their career. It's like 12 weeks will teach you to become a full stack developer, front end, back end, Node.js, React, Angular, TypeScript, whatever, bang. And there's a lot of those people. And so companies that are like, we have a maintenance headache. Well, if we rebuild our systems in JavaScript, we can get cheaper, more cost-effective developers to maintain them. And now that's not going to last forever. That's, JavaScript has a massively entrenched position because of native browser support on the front end, which has almost meant it just sort of swept up the back end as well through sheer force of numbers. But, I love JavaScript as a language, but Node.js was I'm not going to say on the internet that Node.js was a horrible mistake, but go and look at what Ryan Dahl is doing now and ask yourself if he might regret any of the decisions that went into the architecture and ecosystem surrounding running JavaScript on a server. It has some really interesting engineering ideas. The whole asynchronous I/O and, the blocking threads thing, that was very, very cool.
Oh,
but
yeah, I mean, I interviewed Isaac Schuster on the show probably over a year ago now. Like he was one of the inventors of NPM, like trying to solve a problem that was literally created because of the underlying problem, right?
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's very, very interesting, and to be fair, like not to knock on JavaScript, but like all the languages have this problem, right?
Yeah.
Like I think I always say this all the time, developers are very, very lazy. So like give them tool to accomplish some task, no matter how not a good idea that
Hmm.
is. Like, I mean, the amount of copy and pasted code from Stack Overflow that runs in production is probably way too damn high. Now, like the copy and pasted code from ChatGPT that runs in production, way too damn high. But I think you said something very interesting, like that we're never done, right?
Yeah.
Like when I first got started in tech, like we use like the phrase definition of done all the time. Like, what is our definition of done? And now I don't hear that as much when I talk to people out in the world, because I think
Yeah.
the understanding is that okay, the software development lifecycle has been around for 400 years at this point. Like the SDLC was used to create the wheel and fire.
Yeah.
Like so now we like this iterative approach. The problem is that sometimes those iterations are longer than others. So
Yeah.
how do we continue to help people feel that they can innovate, because sometimes it takes years to ship even fast software, right? So when you talk to folks about that particular thing where it's like the monotony of doing the work until it's done, and then you start again with the monotony of the work, like
Yeah.
do you think that technology is, I guess, outside of the money, do you think technology is something that's actually like a good career for to recommend to anybody? Because I struggle with this a lot, because I tell people all the time, like, technology is very challenging. The money's good because it's very challenging.
I think technology, and this is probably going to end on this note here.
Yep,
Nice
exactly.
place to wrap
Yep,
it up.
yep.
I think that there is a certain kind of person who wants to take the problem apart and figure out how to solve it. And I think that technology, and particularly, software, the internet, that offers a compelling toolbox for solving, or not solving, a compelling toolbox for addressing many of the problems that we perceive in society. Things people want. They want to be able to communicate. They want to be able to connect with other people who share the same interests. Same kind of stuff makes them happy. They want music. They want movies. They
Mhm.
want to play games. They want to, these are fun things. Technology facilitates a lot of activities which are purely just enjoyable. You're not doing them for the money, and you're not doing them because they're going to save the world. You're doing them because it's cool. And so, I think that tendency. Interesting question came up the other day. Is, let's say that you and I were teleported right now back to 1983.
Sure.
And we were, a couple of us, we'd listened to the Scott Hanselman podcast about the guy who's just written a new operating system for the Commodore 64.
Yeah.
And it's like, if we took everything we knew now, and you were back in 83 and you had, Commodore 64, or, even like Atari arcade machines and everything, do you think that you would kind of start programming on that hardware? And I think I would, because I
Hmm.
think even right now, with I'd be there, I'm like, well, okay, I know about the internet, but that doesn't really exist yet. The web isn't there yet. This isn't there yet. But you know what? I think I can probably get a C64 to play Tetris, and if I can invent Tetris, then that'll set me
So,
up for life.
so that's the
So,
thing. That's the thing, right? So, like, you're talking about, like, I'm like, okay, so I would go to a sports book immediately and start gambling all sorts of things. I would put all sorts of money into all sorts of different areas, right? Like, because like I want to not have to worry about particular things.
yeah,
But like to your point, like I invented Tetris, or I invent, I don't know, any other
yeah,
technology that existed during that time, and then you're set. Like, oh, I work on the Nintendo or whatever.
yeah,
But I think one of the things that's really brilliant about that innovation during that time is that nobody knew what the hell they were doing, and
yeah,
then all of a sudden they make a bunch of money off of it.
yeah.
And,
But I think,
yeah,
the real question is, if you took away the web, you took away Visual Studio, you took away cloud, Kubernetes, you said to someone now, hey, you got a Commodore 64, do you want to play with it? Would they
yeah,
find any joy in that? And I think I would. I think that that process of figuring out the machine, on some level, the dopamine kick of, hey, I did it, I made it work. I think
yeah,
that would work.
yeah,
We got one question in the stream. I just want to. So
yeah. Of
someone has
course.
asked, how does a graduate get motivated to learn legacy languages? And money is,
Yeah, yeah.
because it's that whole thing of if you were going to build an application today from scratch, you wouldn't use classic ASP.
Yeah.
because the tooling for it has evolved so much beyond the state of the art with what's possible with that platform. And some platforms evolve. PHP, a lot of people kind of they mock PHP, but PHP, modern PHP is good.
Runs
It's
the
got
internet.
first class
Runs
tooling. It
the
runs the
internet.
internet.
Yeah.
Really, really good platforms. Um, so, there are folks out there who do retro computing in all kinds of ways, using retro tools to do work on retro systems. But it's like you can go on the internet and you can get a thing that'll let you plug an SD card into a Commodore 64. So you're not really constrained by the limits of the tech. But yeah, the reason why the thing that I used to say to people when I was hiring for legacy systems is, yeah, the code is old, but it's getting used today. They
Hmm.
are using it to make Star Wars. They are using it to make Doctor Who. They are the people who care about this. You care about what those people are doing. And so the business domain and the problem, even on days when you're like, the code sucks, it's like, yeah, but we're doing it for a reason. And
Yeah.
if you care about the reason, that'll get you through the days when you don't like the code. And if you care about the code, that can get you through any number of days when you don't care about the reason. And on the days when you don't care about either of those things, then you hope that the people you're working with are nice people, and that's going to get you through to the next week.
Yeah.
So,
I think that's pretty spot on. And when we're wrapping up, I think, everything that you said is 100% accurate. I think also, like, the most important thing that I tell people, period, is like, find something that you have interest in, and because you're going to have to do things you're not interested in. So, like, if you're interested in some phase of technology, try to wiggle that into your work. If you're interested in like what the technology does, like you're saying, like, hey man, if I wrote some code that like helps somebody do Star Wars, like,
yeah,
I don't show up in the credits in the movie, but I can go and tell somebody at a party like, oh, like I work on so and so, and like, oh, that thing in Star Wars, like they use my tool, right?
yeah,
That's pretty cool.
yeah.
So as we wrap up, I love to ask my guests one final question, and that question is, if you can think about technology, even to an extent open source, the community around it, but you only had one word for that, Dylan Beattie, what would that one word be for you? It's always good. You can cheat. You can have two words if you want.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Uh,
And one of our commenters said
Collaboration is the one that springs to mind.
collaboration. One of our commenters said rock, and we literally talked for an hour and did not talk about music and Rockstar and all that other cool stuff as well. So you're gonna have to come on the
we've
show.
even both got guitars on the wall behind us.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, mine is art. It's like this is art behind me. Like I touch it every now and then.
This is a tool. This is a real thing. It gets
Yeah.
packed up and I lug it around the world.
No,
and,
yeah. I mean,
and use
I've
it
been
and stuff. So.
I've been playing it more recently, but I jokingly like if you were to hear me play, you wouldn't know that I've been playing for 20 years. Different conversation for a different day. So Dylan, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and chatting with us.
Thank
I had
you
a
so
lovely
much for having
conversation. Did you have any parting words or anything you wanted to add before we sign off?
Have fun. Play with code, play with tech. If you don't enjoy what you're doing with the code, and if you don't enjoy the code, you don't enjoy what you're doing with it, and you don't enjoy the people you're working with, probably time to quit your job.
I got nothing else to say. So if you're not following Dylan already, it's Dylan Beattie on Twitter. I'll also post some links to some other stuff, the things that Dylan is working on. And yeah, this is Isaac Levin. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody.